Good evening, everyone. We're so thankful you've joined us tonight. I'm not Mr. Travis. I think Mr. Mike was just excited to hear another lesson from Mr. Travis, but you get to listen to me tonight. As a junior in high school, I sat in on a foreign language class at a university. I was there predominantly just as a university visit. I wasn't there necessarily for the class itself, but for the college visit experience. And the instructor knew his stuff, backwards and forwards, rattling off all the big terms and everything. It was very evident that he knew his stuff very well. But thankfully, I already had a little bit of a framework for the language, and so to my delight, I was actually able to get a little bit out of the class. Sometimes having that framework makes all the difference. Also, in my early grades, we kind of had the same approach to learning specifically history. In the early grades, we didn't study any one thing in depth. We would study major dates and facts throughout all of history. And then in the upper grades, we'd go back and study something in depth, and we'd have that framework and insert what we learned within that framework. Sometimes having a framework makes all the difference. What about when you build a house? No one starts with the lighting or the trim or the faucet handles. We start with the frame. That's just how things are. But what about the Psalms? There's 150 of them. Where do we start? I think it'll be helpful if we have a framework within which to understand the Psalms. So tonight, let's try to build that framework together. We're going to be in Psalms starting in 123 and looking at 3 consecutive Psalms, 123, 124, and 125. Each one of these exemplifies a category of Psalms, and hopefully when we read through the Psalms later, we can say, oh yeah, that's a lament psalm, or that's a thanksgiving psalm, etc. So let's start in Psalm 123. It says, "Unto you I lift up my eyes, O you who dwell in the heavens. Behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their masters, as the eyes of a maid to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God, until he has mercy on us." This is a lament psalm. Here's some elements of a lament psalm. Number one, the situation is a crisis. Something is just going wrong, whether that's health or some sort of oppression, whatever it might be, something is going wrong. And then we hear some sort of complaint, some cry for help, some plea for help. And then usually at the end of the psalm, even though the body of the psalm might be kind of dark or somber, usually there's an uptick at the end where we end on a joyful note of trust. So here in Psalm 123, there's a crisis going on, and it's introduced using imagery. And what we have to understand is that this Hebrew poetry, because that's what the Psalms are, is not explicit teaching, the way the prophets might be, or the New Testament, or even in the history there might be some explicit teaching. But this is poetry, and it calls to mind images. It helps us to see things in a different light or compare a spiritual truth with something we know from the world. And so this imagery he uses is that of a servant who looks to the hand of their master. And especially in these days, there would have been many people who may have even sold themselves into some form of servanthood to pay a debt that they couldn't pay otherwise. And in that situation, they find themselves looking to the hand of their master to receive something that they don't have of their own. We look to God in times of crisis. That's who we should turn to. And then we're looking at verse 3 and 4. It says, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, have mercy on us. For we are exceedingly filled with contempt. Our soul is exceedingly filled with the scorn of those who are at ease, with the contempt of the proud." And right there's the plea for help. He says, "Have mercy on us, O Lord, have mercy upon us." That's the cry for help. And we can relate to that, can't we? Sometimes we don't know who to turn to except God and ask for mercy. These lament psalms give us permission to ask those questions and to cry out who and why. And they teach us about the who. They teach us about God, both God Almighty, and yet also right beside us, like a friend. They teach us about the why. These complaints, these crying out, It's not a rebellious complaint like the children of Israel back in the desert. This is just the writer spelling out his emotions, his struggles, what he's going through, and begging God to help him. It's as if we're having a conversation with ourselves. Why do I feel this way if I know that God can help me? And we take those emotions to God and cry out and ask for his help. These Psalms teach us that God is ready and willing to act on our behalf. I think about a time, y'all are probably getting tired of me hearing me talk about FPTC, but I love FPTC. And my first year at FPTC, I was just in the beginning stages, taking my first baby steps in trying to study Greek. And Mr. Travis, you probably remember Dr. Trill. I think he was the head of the institute while you were there. And over the course of the week, I spent a little time talking to him. And he said, well, why don't you come over to my office and we'll talk about Greek for a little while. And so we did. And he spent, I don't know how long, 20 or 30 minutes, talking to me about the bread and butter of Greek. And these were things that he would know backwards and forwards. And yet he was so humble to give me his time. He's a busy man. He's the president of this Bible Institute. And I'm sure he's got a list of things to do as long as this building. And yet he took time to give me something, give me information. And so that reminds me of our God that we serve. He is powerful, and in a very small sense, Dr. Petrillo is a powerful man. He leads a very good work. And yet our God, who's so powerful over the entire earth, also is there beside us to help in our darkest moment, just the way Dr. Petrillo sat with me and encouraged me to keep up my studies. These lament psalms teach us about our God. They teach us about his care for us. And they remind us that we need to turn to God for help. Let's look at Psalm 124. This is a Thanksgiving psalm. Thanksgiving psalms are sung after the crisis has passed, as opposed to the lament psalms. And normally what we read is, number one, a report of what happened, what the crisis was, and number two, how God came through and what he did for us. And it describes the help that was received, and then it gives the praise that God deserves. Let's look at verse 1. If it had not been the Lord who is on our side, let not Israel say, if it had not been the Lord who is on our side, when men rose up against us, then they would have swallowed us alive. When their wrath was kindled against us, then the waters would have overwhelmed us. The stream would have gone over our soul, then the swollen waters would have gone over our soul. The psalmist uses imagery here, that of water. He talks about the water would have gone over our soul if it hadn't been the Lord who was on our side. And water is a powerful thing. I remember I was a young child and we were at a friend's pool, and I thought I was a big kid. I thought I could go all the way down to the bottom of the pool. And I had enough air to get to the bottom, and coming up, I realized I might not have enough air to get back to the top. And that was scary. I was okay, but the water earned my respect. And so the imagery here is something we relate to. Probably most of us have been in the water at some point and maybe had some scare like that, or some major scare. The Israelites would have related to this too. They had rivers, and today we just drive across them on a bridge, right? But back then, many of them would have had to ford the river and possibly risk their life. Take, for example, the Jordan River. South of the Sea of Galilee, it averages 90 to 100 feet wide and 3 to 10 feet deep. Now, 3 feet's not very deep, but 10 feet is. And the Israelites, if they traveled and crossed rivers, then this sort of imagery would have been something they relate to very, very well. I remember another time I was on the banks of a river here in Davidson, and it had just stormed a few days before. And this river was high, and I walked to the edge, and I took a stick, and I reached, and I couldn't touch the bottom. And I backed off and said, I don't want to get close to that. That water is powerful. And so this imagery tells us what would have happened if the Lord hadn't been on our side. But the Lord was on our side. And that teaches us that there are some things we cannot do for ourselves. As much as we'd like to, there's some things we cannot do for ourselves. Going on in verse 6, it says, Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. Our soul has escaped as a bird from the snare of the fowlers. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. The hunting imagery used in these verses may be lost in some of us if we're not hunters, The closest thing I can think of to a bird escaping from a snare is when birds get stuck on our back porch. We go out and open the door and watch them fly off and set them free. But again, this is what the Lord has done for us. He has set us free. And that's not something we could have done for ourselves. What has the Lord done in your life? Maybe it's not something that you see right away. Maybe it's not the presence of a good thing, but the absence of a bad thing. For myself, I have not had to suffer any major surgeries or any major illnesses, but I don't think about those things very often because it's not in my life. It's the absence of a bad thing, not the presence of the good thing sometimes. So sometimes we forget to thank God for those things. What about the most basic things? Water and shelter that God has given to us. Those are things that we can be thankful for. Let's jump over to the New Testament and go to Philippians chapter 5. Correction, Philippians chapter 4. That's a mistake in my notes. Philippians chapter 4, verse 18 and 19. Indeed, I have all and abound. I am full, having received from Epaphroditus the things sent from you, a sweet-smelling aroma, an acceptable sacrifice, well-pleasing to God. And my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory by Christ Jesus. Paul has received a gift from the Philippian church, and he says it's a sweet-smelling aroma to God and a sacrifice acceptable to God. And then he says, my God shall supply all your need according to his riches and glory. Do we believe that? That God can supply everything we need and so much more beyond that. What about Colossians chapter 3 and verse 15? And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you are called in one body, and be thankful. We should practice thankfulness not only towards God, but also towards the people in our lives. The Thanksgiving Psalms teach us that there are some things that we cannot do for ourselves. We need God. Back in Psalms 125. This psalm is a trust psalm. And while the lament psalms often have a note of trust at the end, the trust psalm, that's the dominant mood in the entire psalm is trust. I will trust, I will trust, I will trust. No matter what's going on around me, I will trust. Oftentimes there's a description of the threat, something that would make us want to not trust, and yet we still choose to trust. And then there's often a description of God's care. Look with me at Psalm 125, verse 1. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved but abides forever. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. And based on that psalm is one of my favorite songs that we just sang tonight. Now, I'm by no means an expert on the Palestine geography, but from my understanding, Jerusalem sits on a mountainous ridge. To the one side is the Mediterranean Sea, down to the other side is the Jordan River and that plain. And this mountainous region that Jerusalem sits in gives it the security that mountains afford. Throughout most of history, and today to some extent, mountains are an inherent strategic advantage. They provide protection, they make it hard to move in troops, etc. And so for Jerusalem to be surrounded by mountains, then the Lord says, just the same way, I surround my people. I give them protection. I keep them from their enemies. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 6. 2 Kings chapter 6. In this story, it's a very literal way to see that the Lord surrounds his people. 2 Kings chapter 6, there's a massive crisis with the Syrians coming in to threaten God's people. And Elisha and another man are in the city, and they're surrounded by the enemy. And it seems like all hope is lost. They can't get out of the city. They're going to be taken captive. And they go out of the city. Let's start in verse 15. It says, When the servant of the man of God arose early and went out, there was an army surrounding the city with horses and chariots. And his servant said to him, Alas, my master, what shall we do? So he answered, Do not fear. Those who are with us are more than those who are with them. And I imagine the servant must have been thinking, You're crazy. Do you not see the mountains are full of the enemy? But Elijah goes on, verse 17. Elijah prayed and said, Lord, I pray, open his eyes that he may see. Then the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Those were the horses and chariots of fire that the Lord had sent out to protect his people. And so our prayer tonight could be, Lord, open our eyes to show us that you are protecting us. Whom shall we fear? What can man do against us? If the Lord is for us, who can be against us? As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people. Reading on in Psalm 125, verse 3. For the scepter of wickedness shall not rest in the land allotted to the righteous, lest the righteous reach out their hands to iniquity. Do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. As for such as turn aside to their crooked ways, the Lord shall lead them away with the workers of iniquity. Peace be upon Israel. Our trust is in God, but if we're not living in an upright way, as it says here in verse 4, if we're not living in an upright way, then we do have a fear of God's righteous judgment. Our life can give us that quality of knowing that God is taking care of us, not because of something we've done, but because he offers this relationship. And when we live in that relationship, when we live faithfully, then he offers us that protection. Paul in the New Testament exemplified this trust, perhaps more than anyone else. If we look at 2 Timothy chapter 4, we'll see Paul and as he exemplifies that trust. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16. At my first offense, no one stood with me, but all forsook me. May it not be charged against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that the message might be preached fully through me, and that all the Gentiles might hear. Also, I was delivered out of the mouth of the lion. There's only one reason I can think that Paul would have the courage to say, may it not be charged against them there in verse 16. That's because he trusts in the Lord. He knows that his trust is not in man. And even if men forsake him, even if no one stands with him, as he says in verse 17, the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. Paul was a man who trusted, and so we can follow his example. The trust Psalms teach us about God's nature, and they teach us that we need someone higher than ourselves to trust in. Trusting in ourselves rarely works out well. Throughout decades and centuries, the Psalms have been some of the most beloved portions of the Scriptures, both by Jews and today by Christians. And I want us to find joy in them. I believe that that's going to happen best when we have this framework to understand what the Psalms are all about. So as we read through the Psalms, we can look for those lament Psalms. We can look for those Thanksgiving Psalms. We can look for those trust Psalms. And that way, we'll help to relate what we know to other things we know. And as we study, we'll get more and more out of the Psalms. I'm convinced that having this framework is beneficial because in my own experience, when it was shared with me a number of years ago, since that time, I've learned to appreciate the Psalms even more. But I want to leave you with one thing from Romans chapter 5. Romans chapter 5. Just the same way the Psalms teach us about God doing things for us that we cannot do for ourselves, that's all over the New Testament as well. Each one of us, we should realize that we've dug ourselves into a hole we can't dig ourselves out of. It's called sin. We've accrued a debt that we cannot pay. We've got ourselves in a fix that, frankly, we can't get ourselves out of. And I'll be honest, I don't like it when I can't do something for myself. I'd like to be independent and do it for myself. That'd be my preference. But I just have to realize that there are some things in life that I cannot do for myself. As difficult as that may be. And number one on that list is saving myself. I cannot save myself. None of us can. That doesn't work. We can't fix the relationship that we broke. Romans chapter 5, verse 6 and following says, "For when we were without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Much more then, having now been justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God through the death of his Son, much more, having been reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. And not only that, but we also rejoice in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we now have received reconciliation." That right there, that's what we can't do for ourselves. We can't earn our reconciliation. We can't be our own mediator. We needed Christ. And if I were to insist upon doing things by myself, then and reject God, then I'd be foolish to do that. God he offers this gift of grace, and all we have to do is take it. And so I want you tonight to ask yourself if you've taken God's grace, if you've become a Christian, and if not, we want that to change. We want you to study with us. We want to share with you what we found in the Scriptures, because we know to help you too. And if you have received God's grace, we need to ask ourselves if we're living in it, if we're growing in it, or if we're stagnant. Because even if we followed God at one point in the past, we can turn our backs on him. And we don't want that to become a reality. We want to continue to grow in God's grace. There are some things we cannot do for ourselves. Jesus is willing to save us, and we ought to take up that offer of salvation. If you have any need, please reach out to this congregation, and we'd love to study with you. Thank you for your attention. The lesson is yours.